It's Dazza from Downunder. I'm just sitting back here with my mid-afternoon shadow on a Saturday in Australia. There's an issue I'd like to talk to you about, and that is the current relationship between China and Australia, which is being tested. This fracturing the relationship really started to open up last year during the Hong Kong protests, or riots I should say, where the Australian government took a stance in support of the Hong Kong protesters and rioters, with one of the current government's members of parliament, Tim Wilson, actually going over to march with the Hong Kong protesters, which basically is a form of interference in another country's affairs. Also, the foreign minister expressing her support for these Hong Kong protesters at that time. And as we've seen in those Hong Kong protests, there's been a huge amount of brutality by Hong Kong protesters against women, elderly and other people in the public over in Hong Kong. There's been, I suppose, attacks against police, a lot of attacks against police over there, where they got attacked by petrol bombs, bricks and metal weapons in Hong Kong, and supported by Western countries, and as a way of trying to split Hong Kong away from China, just to get Hong Kongers to a similar state as Taiwan, where Western countries can get in there, get their military in there and really, like Taiwan, push up against China. I mean, you saw interference from America with the White House Chief Advisor Steve Bannon on live stream with corrupt businessman Miles Gall, telling the protesters or directing the protesters in their actions, and also offering huge support. So they're online there last year with Badger Leong, who's the leader of the National Front of Hong Kong, which is another writer protester group over there in Hong Kong. And they're offering them monetary support from the American government and through Miles Gall. And interestingly, a week or 2 weeks later, after that live stream, Louis Lowe, who's a colleague of Badger Leong in the National Front, got caught by police with a large amount of explosives. So could you imagine if this happened with the Black Lives Matter protests in Australia and America, where you had a leader from the Chinese government or a top person from the Chinese government on live stream with those protests in the Black Lives Matter, offering them support with monetary support and so on, and then a few weeks later explosives end up with those protesters. I'm sure they would come up with a national security law like Hong Kong and China have come up with now, which does not affect the two systems, one country autonomy. Then we move on to later we move on to the coronavirus, where Liberal MPs were putting posts up inciting violence. Jason Wood, who's a Liberal MP, put on his Facebook a picture of bats to incite some racism, and he got some racist comments against China underneath that post about with the bats, and people saying that Chinese people are disgusting maggots, filthy mutts, and calling them chingers. He allowed those comments to stay on there. Then we look at another Liberal MP, Bernie Finn, who put up the Wuhan lab accusation that the coronavirus comes from the Wuhan lab. That has been debunked. already. That has been totally shown as a false accusation. But he still allowed that post to stay up. And he has had racist comments against Chinese people put underneath his posts. So this incitement of racism amongst the MPs has been happening. Andrew Hastie from the Liberal Party, which is the current government, supported this person from China who was supposed to be a spy. He was found out to be false. So that was another accusation that was debunked. So there's this obsessive attacking on China by this government in Australia, which has led to this crisis in the relationship. This incitement of racism by their politicians has led to over 400 racist attacks on Chinese Australian people, including my wife, who got coughed on when she was going for a walk by an Anglo-Australian guy. So he's now in a situation where the Chinese government have said, we're going to warn our students that there is racism in Australia and they should be careful. Well, Scott Morrison has rebuked that action, has turned around and said that that action is uncalled for. So basically, in essence, he's saying, oh, there's no racism here, nothing to see, you don't need to warn your students. And in the current situation where a lot of education institutions have been affected by the coronavirus, who are wanting to get back to business, are going to be greatly affected by this, because 73% of our education, or the education agents that bring us students from China, are based in China. And for the reputation of their business, they have to take care in where they send their students to study. And so Scott Morrison's actions in rebuking the Chinese government over cautioning its students to come to Australia is stupid. It doesn't make sense. I mean, he's just trying to provoke an issue between Australia and China even more. He is basically being like a mini Trump. He's like Trump's diverting attention away by attacking China, diverting attention away from his incompetence of handling the coronavirus. And basically, Scott Morrison is being a mini Trump in barking at China. That's the only way I can put it. So I don't know where our relationship is going to go with China, with this current government mishandling it. I don't know how industries that have been affected by the coronavirus, how they're going to go forward in the future, especially tourism industry, when there's a lack of faith from people in China coming to Australia because of this racism. But our government's in denial about this racism. At one hand, they say it's un-Australian, but when China warns its citizens about this racism, the Australian government says, oh, there's nothing to see, as if, oh, there's no racism. So yeah, they're just some of my thoughts for the afternoon. Hope you all do well, wherever you are. And thank you for your time. Bye-bye.